Margaret Lawson had always believed that family meant loyalty, protection, and love that didn't fade when things became inconvenient. For most of her 68 years, she lived by that belief. She raised her two children, Daniel and Rebecca, in the same modest house she had shared with their father before he passed away 12 years earlier. She sacrificed vacations, expensive clothes, and even her own dreams to make sure they had good schools, warm meals, and a future filled with opportunity. To Margaret, every sleepless night and every extra hour of work had been worth it because she believed her family would always stand together. But lately something had changed. It began with small things that seemed harmless at first. Daniel started visiting more often, but not in the warm, spontaneous way he used to. His visits felt planned, calculated. Rebecca began calling every other day asking strange questions about Margaret's health, her memory, and whether she had been forgetting things lately. Margaret noticed the way they exchanged glances during family dinners, the way conversations suddenly stopped when she entered the room, and the quiet whispers that followed her when she left. One evening Daniel suggested they hold a family meeting. Margaret thought it was unusual because her children had never been interested in meetings before. They arrived at her house with their spouses, Greg and Linda, carrying folders and serious expressions that made the living room feel less like a home and more like a boardroom. Daniel cleared his throat and spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. He said they were just concerned about Margaret and wanted to make sure everything was organized, in case her health started declining. Rebecca nodded sympathetically and added that they simply wanted to help her manage things before they became too difficult. Margaret forced a polite smile while listening, but inside something felt deeply wrong. She had visited her doctor just 2 weeks earlier and received a clean bill of health. Her mind was sharp, her memory clear, and her body strong enough to maintain the house and garden she loved so much. Yet here they were discussing her decline, as if it were already happening. Daniel even suggested that perhaps it was time to think about giving someone else access to her finances and property decisions, just to make things easier. Margaret listened quietly, nodding when necessary, but every instinct told her something wasn't right. After the meeting ended and the family gathered in the kitchen for dessert, Margaret excused herself and walked slowly down the hallway toward her bedroom. She wasn't tired, but she needed a moment to think. As she passed near the kitchen door, she heard something that made her stop in her tracks. Daniel's voice, low but clear, said, "It won't be long now. We just have to be patient." Rebecca laughed softly and replied, "Honestly, I'm surprised she hasn't started forgetting more things already." Greg added, "Once we get control of the paperwork, everything will fall into place." Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. Her hand gripped the wall beside her as the realization settled in like a cold shadow. They weren't worried about her health. They were waiting for it to fail. They believed she was declining, and worse, they seemed almost pleased about it. Margaret quietly stepped away from the hallway and returned to her room before anyone could notice her listening. She sat on the edge of her bed staring at the photo of her late husband on the nightstand. For the first time in her life, she felt something she had never imagined feeling toward her own children, doubt. But Margaret Lawson was not weak, and she was certainly not declining. In fact, her mind was sharper in that moment than it had ever been before. She realized something important: if her family believed she was losing control, then perhaps it was time to let them keep believing that. Because sometimes the most powerful position is the one where people underestimate you. Margaret slowly stood up, walked to her desk, and opened a drawer where she kept important documents. She stared at the papers for a long moment, then gently closed the drawer again. "If they think I'm declining," she whispered to herself, "they're about to be very surprised." What Margaret's family didn't know was that she had been paying attention to every word, every whisper, and every suspicious glance. And while they believed they were planning her future, Margaret was already preparing something of her own. Something they would never see coming. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapters of this unbelievable family drama, and also tell us in the comments section which country you're watching from, because it's always amazing to see how many people around the world connect with these stories. Margaret had spent her whole life giving everything to her family, but now she was about to discover exactly who they truly were. And as the quiet night settled around her home, one thing became clear. The story her family believed was beginning with her decline was actually the beginning of their biggest mistake. A week after the strange family meeting, Margaret Lawson received another invitation from her children, and this time it came wrapped in cheerful enthusiasm that felt strangely forced. Rebecca called her on a bright Tuesday afternoon, her voice overly sweet as she explained that the whole family wanted to take Margaret out to dinner to celebrate her life and everything she had done for them. Margaret listened quietly, her fingers resting gently on the kitchen table while Rebecca talked about gratitude, appreciation, and family unity. On the surface it sounded touching, even loving, but Margaret had lived long enough to recognize when kindness felt rehearsed. She agreed to the dinner anyway, her voice calm and warm, because she wanted to see what they were really planning. The restaurant Daniel chose was expensive, the kind of place they had never taken her before. When Margaret arrived, her children and their spouses were already seated around a large table, smiling widely as if this evening were a grand celebration. Daniel stood up and hugged her, something he rarely did these days, while Rebecca kissed her cheek and told the waiter to bring champagne. Margaret sat down slowly, observing everything. The way Linda kept checking her phone, the way Greg leaned back in his chair, watching everyone carefully, and the way Daniel seemed eager to steer every conversation. At first the dinner felt normal. They talked about work, about Rebecca's children at school, and about small things that filled the air with polite laughter. But gradually the conversation shifted in a direction Margaret had begun to expect. Daniel asked how Margaret had been feeling lately, whether she had been sleeping well, and whether she had noticed any memory lapses or confusion. Rebecca quickly followed by mentioning a neighbor's elderly mother who had suddenly started forgetting things and needed someone to manage her finances. Linda gently suggested that sometimes it was wise to prepare early for these situations so nothing became chaotic later. Margaret smiled politely and took a slow sip of water, letting them talk while pretending to consider their concern. Inside, however, her thoughts were sharp and alert. She noticed how Daniel kept glancing at Greg before certain topics were raised, almost like they had practiced this conversation beforehand. Then Greg casually asked if Margaret had ever considered letting someone help manage her property and investments, since it could become stressful as people grew older. Margaret simply nodded and said she would think about it, which seemed to please them more than she expected. As the evening continued, the waiter brought dessert and another bottle of champagne that Daniel insisted on ordering. Rebecca raised her glass and said something that sounded sweet on the surface but felt strangely unsettling to Margaret. She said, "To Mom, for everything she's done for us, and for making sure our family will always be taken care of in the future." Everyone clinked their glasses together, smiling warmly. Margaret lifted her glass too, though she noticed how the phrase, "taken care of in the future," hung heavily in the air. Later that night, when the dinner finally ended, Daniel insisted on driving Margaret home. The ride was quiet except for the soft hum of the car engine. Daniel asked a few more gentle questions about her health and reminded her that if she ever felt overwhelmed, the family would gladly step in to help manage things. Margaret thanked him and told him she appreciated their concern. When they arrived at her house, Daniel walked her to the door and hugged her again before leaving. Margaret waited until his car disappeared down the street before stepping back inside. The house was quiet, but her mind was anything but calm. She placed her purse on the kitchen counter and slowly walked toward the hallway when she suddenly realized she had left her scarf in Daniel's car. She stepped back outside intending to call him, but just as she reached the front gate she heard voices coming from down the street where Daniel's car had stopped near Rebecca's vehicle. The windows were open and the night air carried their words clearly. Rebecca laughed first, a sharp sound that made Margaret's chest tighten. "That went better than I expected," she said. Greg replied confidently, "She's already starting to trust the idea. Soon she'll hand over the paperwork herself." Daniel added, "Once that happens, the house and accounts will be under our control. It's just a matter of time." Linda's voice joined in, sounding amused. "Honestly, tonight felt like we were celebrating the beginning of the transfer." Margaret stood frozen behind the gate, the cool night air brushing against her face as the truth settled heavily in her heart. They weren't celebrating her life. They were celebrating the idea of gaining control over everything she owned. The realization hurt more than she expected, but it also brought a strange clarity. Margaret quietly stepped back into the house before anyone could notice her outside. She locked the door gently and stood in the silent hallway thinking about everything she had heard. For the first time since the whispers began, Margaret understood the full picture. Her family believed she was becoming weak, forgetful, and easy to influence. They believed their plan was unfolding perfectly. But what they didn't realize was that Margaret Lawson had just heard enough to confirm every suspicion she had been quietly building in her mind. And as she turned off the lights and prepared for bed that night, a calm determination replaced the pain she had felt only minutes earlier. Because if her family believed they were celebrating the beginning of her decline, they had no idea that Margaret was already preparing something far more powerful than they could imagine. The morning after the dinner, Margaret Lawson woke up earlier than usual, not because she was restless but because her mind had already made a decision during the quiet hours of the night. For years she had trusted her children completely, believing that love and loyalty were things that naturally existed within a family. But the whispers she had overheard and the celebration she had witnessed had shattered that illusion. Still, Margaret was not the kind of woman who reacted with anger or confrontation. Instead, she believed in patience, observation, and quiet preparation. As the sunlight filtered through the curtains of her bedroom, she sat up slowly and reached for her phone. There was one person she trusted outside her family, someone who had helped her manage certain financial matters after her husband passed away many years ago. His name was Michael Torres, a financial advisor and legal consultant who had always treated her with honesty and respect. Margaret dialed his number and waited calmly while the phone rang. When Michael answered, his voice sounded pleasantly surprised to hear from her so early in the morning. Margaret spoke in a gentle but serious tone, explaining that she needed to review all her financial documents, property ownership papers, and legal records as soon as possible. Michael immediately sensed that something important was happening. He didn't ask too many questions over the phone but suggested they meet privately in his office later that afternoon. Margaret agreed, feeling a quiet sense of relief as she ended the call. The rest of the morning passed normally. She watered the plants in her garden, prepared a simple breakfast, and even called Rebecca to thank her again for the wonderful dinner. Rebecca sounded pleased, clearly believing that everything had gone according to plan. Margaret played her role carefully, speaking softly and even mentioning that perhaps they were right about helping her organize certain documents soon. Rebecca's excitement was impossible to hide, and Margaret noticed the slight change in her tone, the kind of satisfaction people have when they think they are winning. By the afternoon Margaret was sitting across from Michael Torres in his office, a quiet room filled with neatly organized files and warm wooden furniture. Michael listened carefully as Margaret described everything she had observed over the past few weeks, the family meeting about her decline, the strange questions about her health, the expensive dinner, and finally the conversation she overheard outside her house. When she finished speaking, Michael leaned back in his chair and remained silent for a moment, absorbing the seriousness of what she had just revealed. Finally he spoke calmly, explaining that situations like this were unfortunately not uncommon when large assets or properties were involved. Margaret owned her house outright, had significant savings, and several investments her late husband had built over the years. It was understandable that someone might try to gain control of those assets if they believed she was vulnerable. Margaret nodded slowly, though hearing it explained so clearly still felt painful. Michael then asked an important question. Had she given anyone access to her bank accounts, documents, or power of attorney? Margaret shook her head firmly. She had always kept control of her affairs. Michael smiled slightly and said that was very good news because it meant everything was still entirely in her hands. From that moment, the conversation shifted from concern to strategy. Together they began reviewing every document connected to Margaret's finances and property. Michael showed her how easily someone could attempt to manipulate legal authority if the right paperwork was signed under pressure. He also explained several ways to strengthen her protection, including updating her will, restructuring certain accounts, and ensuring that any attempt to gain control would require strict legal oversight. Margaret listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes. She felt stronger with every passing minute, not because she wanted revenge but because she wanted fairness and truth. If her children had truly cared for her, they would have respected her independence rather than planning behind her back. By the end of the meeting, Margaret had made several decisions. Some assets would be moved into protected trusts. Certain names would be removed from future inheritance plans until trust could be rebuilt. Most importantly, any major decision about her finances would require independent legal verification rather than family approval. Michael assured her that everything could be arranged quietly and legally without raising suspicion. As Margaret left the office later that evening, she felt a calm confidence that had been missing only days earlier. Her family believed she was slowly losing control, but in reality she had just taken more control than ever before. The plan they thought was unfolding was actually leading them somewhere they had never expected. And Margaret was prepared to let them continue believing their assumptions for a little while longer. Because sometimes the best way to reveal someone's true intentions is to give them the illusion that their plan is working. If you're enjoying this story and want to see what happens next when Margaret's secret preparations begin to change everything, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter. And also tell us in the comments section which country you're watching from because it's always fascinating to see viewers from all around the world following these stories. Margaret Lawson stepped into the cool evening air outside Michael's office and looked up at the fading sunset. Her family believed they were patiently waiting for her decline, but what they didn't know was that their patience was about to lead them straight into the surprise Margaret was quietly preparing. Over the next few weeks, Margaret Lawson began playing a role so convincingly that even she was surprised by how easily it worked. She moved slowly when her children were around, occasionally pretending to forget small things like where she placed her reading glasses or whether she had already made tea that morning. None of it was dramatic, just enough to quietly support the story her family had already decided to believe. Daniel started visiting more often, always offering to help organize paperwork or review bank statements. Rebecca called almost every day now, her voice filled with gentle concern as she asked whether Margaret was feeling confused or overwhelmed by her responsibilities. To anyone watching from the outside, it might have looked like a caring family supporting an aging mother. But Margaret saw the small details that revealed their true intentions. She noticed the way Daniel's eyes lingered on her desk drawer, where she kept important documents, and how Rebecca subtly suggested that perhaps it was time for someone else to manage certain decisions. Margaret responded exactly how they hoped she would. She nodded thoughtfully, sighed occasionally, and even mentioned that sometimes it was hard to keep track of everything these days. Each time she said something like that, she saw the flicker of satisfaction in their expressions. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Margaret and Michael Torres were moving carefully through every step of a quiet but powerful plan. New legal protections were established around her property and financial accounts. Certain assets were transferred into structures that required strict legal approval before anyone could access them. Most importantly, Margaret updated her will and created a set of conditions that would ensure her wishes were honored exactly as she intended. Michael worked methodically, making sure every document was prepared with precision so nothing could be challenged later. Margaret appreciated his calm professionalism. He never pushed her toward revenge or anger. Instead, he focused on fairness and clarity. Margaret wasn't trying to punish anyone unnecessarily. She simply wanted the truth to reveal itself. One afternoon, Daniel arrived unexpectedly with a folder in his hands and an eager smile on his face. He explained that he had spoken with a friend who worked in finance and believed it would be wise for Margaret to sign a temporary document allowing him to help manage certain transactions in case she became overwhelmed. Margaret looked at the papers slowly, adjusting her glasses as if struggling to read the fine print. Inside, she felt a quiet confirmation of everything she had suspected. Daniel sat patiently, pretending to be supportive while clearly hoping she would sign without hesitation. Margaret finally placed the papers down and said softly that she might need a little more time to think about it because sometimes paperwork confused her these days. Daniel quickly reassured her that it was only a simple form and that he would come back another day to go through it again. After he left, Margaret placed the folder in her desk and called Michael immediately. Within an hour he had reviewed the document and confirmed exactly what they expected. It would have given Daniel significant authority over several of Margaret's financial decisions. That evening Margaret sat quietly in her living room reflecting on how close her family believed they were to success. They thought patience would eventually give them control. What they didn't realize was that every step they took was simply giving Margaret more evidence and more time to finalize her own plans. Over the next few days Margaret continued allowing the illusion to grow. She mentioned to Rebecca that perhaps they should all gather again soon to discuss important family matters. Rebecca sounded excited and immediately suggested a large family meeting at Margaret's house the following week. Margaret agreed warmly, saying it would be nice to have everyone together to settle things while she still felt capable of making decisions. Rebecca promised to inform Daniel and the others right away. After the call ended, Margaret walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street in front of her home. The same house where she had raised her children, celebrated birthdays, and built decades of memories was now about to become the place where everything would finally be revealed. She felt calm rather than nervous because the truth had a strange way of bringing peace when you were prepared to face it. Michael had already agreed to attend the meeting, though our family had no idea he would be there. All the documents were ready, every legal protection carefully arranged, and every decision thoughtfully made. Margaret wasn't declining the way they believed. She was preparing the moment that would change their understanding of her completely. If you're enjoying this story and you want to see the final chapter where Margaret's surprise is finally revealed, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. And also tell us in the comments section which country you're watching from because it's amazing to see people from all over the world following this story. As the evening sun slowly faded beyond the rooftops, Margaret Lawson closed the curtains and prepared for the coming week. Her family believed the next meeting would bring them closer to controlling her future, but what they didn't know was that the surprise Margaret had been quietly building was finally ready. The day of the family meeting arrived with a calm morning that felt almost ordinary, but Margaret Lawson knew it would become one of the most important days of her life. She woke early, brewed a cup of tea, and sat quietly by the window watching the sunlight slowly spread across her garden. For years she had imagined family gatherings in this house as moments of warmth and laughter, but today's gathering carried a very different purpose. Still, Margaret felt no anger as she prepared herself. What she felt instead was clarity. Every step she had taken over the past few weeks had led to this moment. By the afternoon the house began to fill with familiar voices. Rebecca arrived first, carrying a tray of pastries and wearing the same overly caring smile Margaret had grown used to lately. Daniel arrived shortly after with Linda, and Greg followed a few minutes later. They greeted Margaret warmly, asking how she was feeling and whether she had been able to think more about the documents Daniel had shown her earlier in the week. Margaret welcomed them all into the living room, moving slowly and carefully the way she had practiced in front of them before. The family sat down around the coffee table, exchanging polite conversation while quietly waiting for Margaret to begin the discussion they believed would give them the control they had been anticipating. Daniel eventually leaned forward and spoke gently, reminding Margaret that she had mentioned wanting to settle some important matters while she still felt comfortable doing so. Margaret nodded thoughtfully and folded her hands in her lap. She thanked everyone for coming and said she appreciated how concerned they had been about her well-being. Her calm tone seemed to reassure them, and Rebecca even reached over to squeeze her hand as if the moment were filled with loving support. Then Margaret said there was one more person who needed to join them before they started. Daniel looked slightly confused but didn't question it. A moment later there was a knock on the front door. Margaret stood slowly and walked to open it, revealing Michael Torres standing calmly with a small briefcase in his hand. The room fell quiet as Margaret invited him inside. Daniel's smile faded slightly while Rebecca exchanged a quick glance with Greg. Margaret introduced Michael as the advisor who had been helping her review all of her legal and financial documents recently. Michael greeted everyone politely and took a seat beside Margaret. The tension in the room began to grow as Margaret calmly explained that over the past few weeks she had spent a great deal of time thinking about the future of her assets, her home, and her legacy. She spoke slowly and clearly, her voice steady in a way that immediately contradicted the fragile image her family had been imagining. Daniel attempted to interrupt politely, saying they were only trying to help her manage things if she ever became overwhelmed. Margaret raised her hand gently, signaling that she wished to finish speaking first. She explained that she had carefully reviewed every account, every property document, and every legal agreement connected to her estate. She also mentioned that she had overheard certain conversations that made her realize how important it was to make her intentions absolutely clear. The room grew noticeably uncomfortable as her children began to understand that something unexpected was happening. Michael then opened his briefcase and placed several organized documents on the table. Margaret explained that she had officially updated her will, established legal protections around her assets, and placed several properties into protected trusts that could not be accessed or controlled by anyone without strict independent oversight. She calmly added that anyone attempting to manipulate her decisions or gain control through pressure would automatically be excluded from any future inheritance considerations. Daniel's face turned pale while Rebecca looked completely stunned. Greg attempted to speak but quickly realized there was nothing he could say that would change the situation. Margaret then looked around the room at each of them with the same steady calm she had carried throughout the entire meeting. She told them she had spent her entire life providing love, security, and opportunity for her family, but she had never expected to hear them quietly celebrating the possibility of her decline. Her words were not angry, just honest. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Finally Margaret said something that no one in the room had anticipated. She explained that while some of her assets would still be shared among family members who showed genuine care and respect, a significant portion of her estate would now go toward charitable foundations and community programs that helped families and elderly people who truly needed support. The decision had already been finalized legally. The control her children believed they were waiting for had never been within their reach at all. Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair and thanked everyone again for coming to the meeting. Her voice remained calm but carried a quiet authority that none of them could ignore. The story they had been expecting to end with her decline had instead revealed a very different ending. And if you've enjoyed this full story of betrayal, patience, and truth, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss more powerful stories like this, and also tell us in the comments section which country you are watching from, because it's always incredible to see viewers joining from all over the world. As the meeting slowly came to an uneasy close, Margaret Lawson looked around the room one final time. Her family had believed they were waiting patiently for her weakness, but what they had really been waiting for was the moment they discovered just how strong she truly was.